Good morning, and welcome to part one of the Leadership and Regulatory Forum. I'm your moderator. I'm the Professor and Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University, and I also sit on the Clinical Trials BC Advisory Council. So today we have 4 presentations, each of which will be 8 to 10 minutes in length, followed by 30 minutes of moderated discussion. Please address your questions to a particular panel member so I can direct them appropriately, and do so by using the Q&A chat box for the session. Our 4 speakers are Mary Ackenhusen, who holds the appointment of Senior Executive in Residence and Lead for the Partnerships and Innovation Division at the British Columbia Ministry of Health. This exciting new role is focused on health innovation and aligns with Mary's 20-year impact on health system transformation in the BC health sector. From 2014 to 2020, Mary was the President and CEO of Vancouver Coastal Health, having joined VCH in 2007 as Chief Operating Officer after serving on the Fraser Health Authority's leadership team for 7 years. In 2019, Glassdoor, one of the world's largest employee recruitment sites, named Mary as one of Canada's top 25 CEOs based on employee reviews. Mary is a graduate of the Harvard Business School's Master of Business Administration program and the West Virginia University's Industrial Engineering program. Our second speaker is Dr. Daniel Keene, who's the Associate Director of the Office of Clinical Trials at the Therapeutic Products Directorate at Health Canada. After obtaining his medical degree from the University of Saskatchewan, he completed his postgraduate medical training in pediatrics at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto and neurology at the Montreal Neurological Institute. He is a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada with specialty certification in both pediatrics and neurology. In addition, he has obtained a Master of Arts in Public Policy from Carleton University and a graduate certificate in Academic Excellence in Epidemiology from the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan. Prior to his work at Health Canada, he was an active member of the medical faculty at the University of Ottawa in the departments of Pediatrics and Medicine and senior clinical investigator at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario. Our third speaker is Wendy Hurlburt, who's President and CEO of Life Sciences BC. She's a passionate global executive with more than 25 years of experience in the life sciences and technology sectors. Wendy has held leadership positions in Johnson & Johnson and the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Ontario and Lexmark International, where she provided strategic leadership across finance, business development, operations, IT, privacy, compliance, regulatory quality, and risk management. Her global experience includes leadership roles across Canada, the United States, Europe, and South Asia. Wendy has a BA in Finance and Economics from Western University in Ontario, an MBA from Queen's University, a certificate in Strategic Leadership from the Sauder School of Executive Education, and is a certified privacy professional. Wendy serves on the Clinical Trials BC Advisory Board and many other boards. Our final speaker is Dr. Gavin Stewart, who is the former Dean of Medicine at the University of British Columbia. His tenure was from 2003 to 2015, and former UBC Vice Provost of Health from 2009 to 2016. He continues as an academic gynecologic oncologist at BGH and BC Cancer, engaged in clinical care, teaching, and research focused on clinical trials. He's published numerous national and international trials in gynecologic cancer, and he is the chair of the Clinical Trials BC Advisory Council. And now I'd like to welcome our speakers. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Mary Ackenhusen, and I'm the Senior Executive in Residence at the BC Ministry of Health for Innovation. And prior to joining the ministry, I was an executive in the healthcare system for the past 20 years, and for the last 6 years, I was the President and CEO of Vancouver Coastal Health. Now, I've always been passionate about how we use innovation to transform our public system to be a better system, more sustainable with higher quality outcomes. And so coming to the ministry, it's been very exciting to take a systems approach to this work. And my goal is to create the strategy and the infrastructure to more systematically hardwire innovation into our healthcare system, starting with the ministry itself, and supportive of all the amazing work that happens throughout the health ecosystem, within the health authorities, by our researchers, the life sciences industry, community providers, and academia. Now, we know the pandemic's brought a lot of suffering to many in the past year, physically, mentally, socially, economically. It's been incredibly disruptive, mostly in negative ways, but there have been a few bright lights. And one of them has been the way our public health system has responded. So while we often think of ourselves as a bureaucratic monopoly, we shed that and we became agile, nimble, and innovative almost overnight, which is very exciting and something we need to build on. So what I want to talk about today is how did we pivot so quickly when previously we've had so much difficulty being nimble and quick. We've been a very incremental system in terms of change, but all that was different during the pandemic. Barriers fell and we had a new mindset and our actions emerged that embraced new ideas and approaches like never before. Interestingly, there's a research that shows what are the key common attributes of organizations that are high performing. And those are listed on this slide: alignment, execution, adaptability. And these are areas that we really upped our game in the healthcare system when we were responding to the pandemic. So starting with alignment, we knew very clearly what our purpose was, what our goal was, and that was to keep the healthcare system from being overwhelmed when the pandemic hit BC. And so we realigned everything that we were doing to that singular goal, to make sure that we were caring for patients in the best way possible and that we weren't overwhelmed. So resources were realigned, such as the finances, people, staffing, reassignments, all of this for the common goal. We also improved our execution. We moved to a different way of making decisions. We moved to emergency operations centers, which were set up across all the health authorities and in the Ministry of Health. And they basically involved having all the right people at the table, often several hours a day, the subject matter experts, the executive, the CFO, to make sure that the initiatives that were undertaken were advancing properly, that we had clear accountability, we had clear timelines, we were able to make decisions, we were able to remove barriers as we were meeting on a daily basis. No barrier would be unnoticed because every day we would come back to it and make sure that things were moving to make sure that we were successful in our strategies and tactics. And innovation was no different. With everyone around the table, when new ideas came forward, the executive were there to say, yes, let's do it. The CFO was there to say, yes, we'll fund it. And when the innovations didn't turn out, everyone's also back at the table to say, this didn't work, let's try something different. So innovation was well supported. And then the third attribute is adaptability. And that means that when things change in the environment, a high-performing organization can change their strategies and tactics in response and pivot to a new strategy or tactic. And we did that as well. The virus was unknown to us, so things changed all the time. We found out pretty quickly what worked and what didn't work, and we were able to change based on that. When the science changed, we changed our response. When we didn't get the outcomes we were looking for, we tried different strategies. So we were very adaptable. So with this context, which I hope gives you some insight and curiosity into how healthcare continues to be a force for change and innovation, even after the pandemic, how do we apply these learnings that we've had to the other challenges that we are faced with in our system? Well, many would say that the degree and speed of innovation that we brought forward in the pandemic was a key reason for our success in protecting most of our population from the very worst impacts of the pandemic. And of course, I need to say most, because we are all devastated by the impact on the elderly and long-term care and some of the other vulnerable populations that have been severely impacted by the pandemic. But history suggests that companies that invest in innovation through a crisis not only perform better during the crisis itself, but also outperform their peers during the recovery after the crisis. And during the pandemic, we have invested in innovation, but will we continue to do this? When health budgets start to tighten in order to begin that multi-year exercise of balancing the government budget, will we have the foresight to continue our investments in innovation? Innovation does need to be in the front and center in the planning process. Big, innovative, and well-executed strategies are often drivers of true transformation and serves as a counterweight to our usual mindset of incremental safe changes, those that we favor most in healthcare. And this is where I fear we fall short in our current healthcare system. It's a challenge at the ministry level as much as it is in the health authorities. And again, referencing the McKinsey study, they found in the companies that they studied, there was an enormous difference in how deeply executives engaged in innovation-related activities. And they found that despite the high importance that executives say they place on innovation, fewer than 25% were actually involved in setting innovation targets and budgets. And that figure points to the shift in mindset that we as healthcare leaders must also make. Innovation won't happen without nurturing and support from leadership. We're all focused on the present and on the ongoing hard work required to minimize the deaths and suffering of the second wave of the COVID. We're tired, and yet we must continue this intense response for fear of what will happen if we do not. However, when we emerge from the worst impacts of the pandemic later this year, we will still have big challenges in front of us. Growing demand pressures due to the aging demographic, the growth we see in chronic diseases that need ongoing care, catching up on our surgical volumes, financial constraints as the government works to balance the budget, and of course, our ongoing, growing and increasing shortage of human resources to work in the health sector. These are the challenges we talked about before the pandemic, and we will continue to work on to solve after the pandemic is gone. So to solve these big problems, we need to tackle them in the same manner that was successful during the pandemic. And this starts with setting an ambitious target. In February and March, at the beginning of the pandemic, we were driven by a very ambitious target. We saw what was happening in Wuhan, Italy, New York, and this became our ambition to avoid a similar overwhelming of the system with all the fallout. It made us become agile and innovative overnight. But the question, once we get through wave 2, hopefully no wave 3, will be how do we articulate and act upon the healthcare challenges that are equal and perhaps even greater to those presented during the pandemic? Can we mobilize a similar response to these challenges? Can we articulate the ambitious vision that will be needed in order to solve the challenges in our BC system? Because this means setting targets that may not seem achievable right now. This was what was required of us when we addressed the pandemic, and we amazed ourselves at how effectively we were able to respond. Can we do this again? Historically, what can too often trip us up in our quest to transform healthcare is the immediate versus the emerging. And the pandemic was rapidly moving around the world, and we knew we were in its path, and we had a limited time frame measured in weeks to be ready. The need to act was immediate, and we all jumped on board to save BC from the terrible known threat of the pandemic. The current and future healthcare challenges are more like the proverbial frog who's in the water as it's heating up, but never quite realizes until it's too late that it's being boiled alive. So to succeed in the post-COVID-19 pandemic world, we need to be embedding innovation in our strategies up front. Be bold, ambitious, just as we have been in our fight against the pandemic, because incremental change will no longer achieve the healthcare system that our citizens need. We'll need to leverage the advances in digital health, technology, automation, artificial intelligence, personalized medicine, team-based care, to name a few of the big game changers that we can adopt with this mindset. So the real question is not if we can overcome these challenges. We've proven that we can if we adopt the mindset that made us successful in combating the pandemic. So is our system up for this? I would say we have some of the right ingredients and learnings that can be used to help us to get there, but it's not a given. Old habits don't die easily, and we can see a return to the old habits, old, less effective ways of working already. So in closing, I would argue that it's our job as leaders, researchers, and innovators in the system. We need to articulate the challenge in a very compelling way that can energize the many assets of our system and actively harness the learnings of the pandemic to the benefit of our future system. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon.
Up with the innovation that we need to address the complexities that have come out of this pandemic. We also have seen an unprecedented amount of knowledge generation. Who can keep up with all the webinars, texts, reports, everything else that we get constantly. It's amazing how much information is out there for us to sift through. We also continually, in particular in the life sciences sector, see a convergence of scientific disciplines, one that is creating amazing, amazing innovation, but an area that is hard to keep up with depending on where you sit in the ecosystem. Of course, we're in the era of data. Who can't talk about data and not be amazed at what is possible today? The integration of big data, genomics, personal data, computational computing, AI, all of these are happening exponentially in life sciences at the research level, the academic level, the drug discovery level, and even as we apply it into our existing healthcare system. The possibilities are endless, and it requires all of us working together to be able to realize those possibilities. We also have, as we all know, and part of what gathered us here, is a complex and fragmented global regulatory environment with varying compliance systems and reimbursement systems around the globe. So with all of that, it's not all bad. We have expertise that we have at our fingertips within the life sciences sector that is willing and able and enthusiastically working together to address many, many of our different challenges, but also many of our opportunities to bring innovation to market. And as Helen Keller said, alone we can do so little, together we can do so much. Necessity, as we know, is the mother of invention, and I would add also innovation. So when necessity struck, we saw 2020 have a year that was probably unimaginable as we think where we were sitting almost a year ago. But we also learned a lot this year, and we proved a lot to ourselves that we already probably knew, but hadn't had an environment that really forced us to come together. So we know we can act fast. It's extraordinary what happened last year and the amount of change and innovation that came to market. We also saw the importance of science-grounded innovation be widely accepted. We had people that were outside of our sector talk about the importance of science-based decisions. We had politicians debating it around the globe. We know and we heard from others that science-grounded innovation is important, and we all need to work together to ensure that we stay rooted in that. We also saw many organizations pivot. At Life Sciences BC, I spent the first 3 months of the COVID pandemic talking to companies that wanted to become medical device manufacturers or become working on therapeutics, or how could they help, and really trying to guide them through what it takes to be successful in this sector. We saw multiple examples of global collaboration and partnerships that historically would have taken longer to pull together. And we saw that when we weren't traveling. We saw that when we weren't spending time nurturing partnerships, we came together for a common goal and worked together and looked for partners that created synergies for what we were trying to offer. We saw all stakeholders working together in an unprecedented manner: research, industry, government, regulators. And I applaud our regulators because, my goodness, were they working around the clock to try and keep the supply chain moving of products that may not have previously been approved, or new products that were on the market that they needed to break the current business model and processes and think about, how can we do this faster? How can we stay true to the integrity of ensuring that we have the quality of products available that we need, while also trying to do this in a very expedited manner? Two examples that we're very proud of, especially as a BC-based organization, is the partnership that we saw come together with Pfizer, BioNTech, and Acuitas. So that vaccine that is rolling out today is based off of Acuitas technology, the mRNA delivery mechanism. BioNTech and Acuitas have been working together on cancer vaccines, very quickly pivoted. Pfizer came into the fold, and now we have a vaccine that is rolling out globally. It's extraordinary, the power of global partnerships. We also have seen the Eli Lilly therapeutic that has received emergency use authorization in many jurisdictions be based off of BC-based Abcelera's local technology. So again, necessity is the mother of invention. So for the life sciences sector, probably not surprising, I think the time is now. There is no sector that is better positioned today to address some of the complex issues that we're addressing. Scientific discovery and the associated application is driving global public health solutions that are critical to the economic recovery. And with the economic recovery, returns the social stability of our globe, in addition to addressing some of the very complex healthcare issues that we're dealing with. So life sciences is really what's going to bring it together. But life sciences isn't only scientists. It's everybody in this sector working together to help bring solutions to market. And who are those people? Well, here's a snapshot. I've probably missed a few, but we are not just scientists, we are not just business people, and we are not successful unless we all collaborate, build relationships with each other, and build strong partnerships. So that's the clinical trials community, the research and academia, health authorities, local and global industry, the investors and the service providers that play a critical role, lawyers, the accountants, the regulatory, pricing, procurement, privacy professionals. Our respective governments play a huge role. We rely on our governments to keep ourselves safe and our regulatory bodies, but we also need to enable them to be able to do that in a fast and effective way. And of course, organizations like Life Sciences BC and our sister organizations across the globe play the role within the ecosystem of bringing all of these stakeholders together to develop partnerships, to collaborate, and to work together, driving innovation and bringing innovation to the market. So what are the elements of a successful partnership? And I'm sure many of you can talk about this and have been involved in many, and some that have been super successful and others where you've taken learnings away that may have made them more successful for future iterations. So leadership is obviously critical. There has to be leadership of a partnership, and there has to be leadership and aligned leadership among the parties that are coming together in a partnership. A common vision and mission is critically important. You need to be working towards the same goal. Culture and values are also important. How we treat employees, how we approach projects, how we report on projects, how we talk to each other. An expression that I use frequently is, let's make sure we're always talking to in each other's listening ears. And what that means is be sure that people understand communication, as we all know, is two-way, and we have responsibility to ensure that we understand each other. But if we speak in language and vocabulary that people don't understand, it's very hard to find that common goal. Synergies are important. Our best partners are those that bring to the table what we can't bring. Defined roles and responsibilities, measurable goals, and a conflict resolution strategy. Some of our best ideas come from mistakes and debates. So let's not be scared to have healthy conflict amongst partners. Our partners make us stronger. So with that, and with my limited time, I want to share a final quote from Henry Ford. Coming together is the beginning, staying together is progress, and working together is success. Our sector has always been good at coming together. In 2020, we saw that pay off exponentially for our society and our globe. Let's ensure we stay together to make progress and work together for the continued success of the life sciences sector and for the benefit of our globe. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Good afternoon. I'm Gavin Stewart again, and I'm going to be talking to you about the Clinical Trials BC Advisory Council and what our path forward looks like. I have no significant financial interests or non-financial interests that would represent a conflict. I will start just by giving you a little bit of background on the current overall landscape of clinical trials in BC. As you can see from this graphic, there are a large number of trials being conducted across the province, more than 1,300 active trials presently. I have indicated here the various health authorities and the anchor universities within each of the health authority geographic areas. Obviously, Provincial Health Services Authority reaches across the province or has a span across the province and intersects with numerous universities as well. I'd also point out that of these clinical trials, approximately 85% of them are interventional, that there is an intervention being brought to bear in a population of patients. But there are some that are engaging healthy volunteers, approximately 9%, and about 3% of the active trials are actually observational trials where there is a cohort of patients being followed. There are more than 100 designated clinical trial sites in British Columbia, so that has an immense geographical span. And there's more than 900 investigators registered conducting clinical trials in our province. This particular graphic shows the number of trials in a longitudinal manner starting from 2014 through to 2020. And as you can see, there's actually a fairly good level of consistency across those years with the number of trials that are being conducted. I would note that this current year, there are more than 22 actively enrolling COVID trials. I'd also point out that on this slide, we talk about actively enrolling trials, whereas on the subsequent trial or subsequent slide, we'll talk about trials that are either not yet accruing or have closed to accrual. You can see on this slide that the number of active trials is higher, but just because of what I said. And I would also point out that the proportion of clinical trials performed in Canada in British Columbia has remained fairly consistent at approximately 20% over the last several years. And we view this as a positive. This particular slide is a bit busy, but I would draw your attention to at least three aspects. Number one, I think you can see in the upper left corner with the bar graph that the largest number of clinical trials that are currently occurring are in the domain of oncology. I don't think this is surprising, and it's usually reflected in the patterns of practice in most jurisdictions. I also note that there are some diagnostic trials being performed, and furthermore, there's a small number of devices in clinical trials. The second piece I would comment on is the Venn diagram on the right side, and you can see that the large proportion of trials are phase 3 trials and a significant proportion of phase 2. A relatively small proportion of phase 1 trials, only 7%. And this is an area that correlates well with drug development and early drug discovery as one goes to first in human studies and then phase 1 trials, and may be an area to focus on in the future. And then the bar graph at the bottom demonstrates the source of funding. And you can see that there are a number of trials that are NIH funded. There are some that are university or grant funded, but there's still a large proportion, more than half of the trials are industry funded. So some of you might ask, what is Clinical Trials BC? And Clinical Trials BC is a component of the British Columbia Academic Health Science Network, or the BC AHSN. There are three key components, one of which is Clinical Trials BC, or what we refer to as CTBC. There is the BC Support Unit, and there is Research Ethics BC. The vision of CTBC is, as you see before you here, to establish and promote British Columbia as a world-class destination for the conduct of high-quality clinical trials. Ultimately, the mission is to maximize the health, educational, and economic benefits of clinical trials to the population that we serve. These are the objectives and activities currently within the domain of Clinical Trials BC. You'll see there clinical research navigation. I'm not going to read through each of these, but this is largely related to the infrastructure and backroom functions related to the conduct of clinical trials and how we draw those to British Columbia. The second area of professional development and training is everything from enhanced understanding and education related to the conduct of clinical trials. It relates to certification, support, and guidance, as well as education of the sites. The third area is that of regulation and quality assurance. We're very lucky within CTBC to have strength in this regard, led by Jean Smart, that most of you will know. And this really serves the function of ensuring that regulatory compliance and quality consulting are in place. It does invoke the use of quality management system and then implementation of all of this to ensure that the trials that are being conducted are of the highest quality. The next one is to improve the patient experience. And this is very much engaging with patients as partners in the conduct of clinical trials and ensuring that the advocacy, development, implementation, and analysis of clinical trials is done as a collaborative and shared process. And then finally, program development and support relates to the workforce, it relates to mentoring, as well as the broad infrastructure activities, including conferences such as we're all participating in today. The team supporting Clinical Trials BC is the leadership within the BC Academic Health Science Network. Dr. Sterling Bryan, most of you will know, and Dr. Danielle Lavallee, and of course, Alison Orth, who has really been the leader of Clinical Trials BC as the unit director. The others down below here, I've called out on Jean Smart earlier, Dan, who has led our communications, Sarah, our project coordination, and Mark with project management. CTBC is supported by an advisory council. I have the privilege of serving as chair of that advisory council, and you can see the other members representing a cross-section of the leadership in the domain of clinical trials within the province. I'm particularly pleased with the engagement of our patient partners, Margaret McDonald and Melanie Reed, who have really brought a unique contribution to the table in the discussions of our advisory council. There are a number of activities that the CTBC has undertaken that are enabled through the BC Academic Health Sciences Network. I won't read these here, but I think you can see the domain of health research, education and capacity building, and transformative partnerships, particularly with patients as partners, but as well with clinicians and the leadership within the health authorities and the health system. I hope I've given you a quick snapshot of what Clinical Trials BC is about. Thank you very much for being part of this conference, and happy to answer questions on the chat line. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone, because I believe that we are live, and we're just moving all of the speakers into the main stage. I'm hoping for a note here when we can start with questions, but everyone can hear everybody. I'm going to start with a question from the audience, from Cindy Triton. Mary, Cindy has a question for you. What is the working definition of innovation in the health system in British Columbia?
Great question, Cindy. And my team has struggled with that and talked about, how do we come together with that same vocabulary and same definition, which we have not done yet. My mind, innovation is anything that we have not done here in BC in a systematic way that improves the efficiency and effectiveness of our system, either on the clinical side or on the administrative side. So I take a very broad view of this definition, but I do try to distinguish between quality improvement, which is often incremental, and innovation, which I think should be more leapfrog in nature. Good question.
Thanks, Mary. So I'm just going to follow up with on Cindy's question, because you spoke about hardwiring the innovation, now that it defined, into the health system, and starting with the ministry itself. So can you explain a little bit more what you mean by hardwiring innovation and how it will make a difference?
I'm not sure if you can hear me, Tanya. I cannot hear me.
Okay, we seem to have a technical issue with sound as well. Can other speakers hear me? Okay, okay, good. So I'm going to switch from Mary until we can get her back. And I have a question. I think it might be directed at Gavin, but Health Canada from Daniel might have some views as well. This is a question from Hee Song Sun. What kind of training programs and certifications are available for clinical trial personnel?
So I'm happy to have a stab at that. Certainly, if one goes to the Clinical Trials BC website, there is a contact button there that will allow you to tap into what is currently on offering. But perhaps more important than actually running courses or providing courses, Clinical Trials BC has done a very good job of coordinating capacity across the health authorities where a lot of this training does take place, as well as the academic institutions. So I would encourage you as through the website with specific questions about what type of program or certification one is required.
Thank you. So I have a question from Beverly Pomeroy for Wendy. Where does or where can patient partners sit in the life sciences ecosystem? Do you think we need to be more explicit or purposeful in encouraging and developing patient partners in that ecosystem, or is that already being done?
I would answer that is in that, of course, patients need to be included in the partnerships in the ecosystem. As we talked in a panel earlier this week, I think all of us, as we think about the health ecosystem, in fact, play multiple roles. We have we have the role that we're playing in our professional life, but we all, at some point in time, are patients or patient caregivers. And it's important that patients do have a voice. I know that Sterling talked about that at some point earlier this week, and we need to ensure that that voice is appropriately brought into the discussions at the appropriate times. I think there is some initiatives that are going on underway. I'm not an expert in this area, but as where I sit in thinking about partnerships and collaborations in the life sciences sector and being able to both produce and get access to much of the innovation that is coming forward, of course, patients play an incredibly critical role, whether it's in clinical trials or in the clinical setting or in receiving that innovation.
Thanks, Wendy. I'll also note that for the previous question about training opportunities, there's quite a bit of information that's popping up in the Q&A in the chat from Clinical Trials BC and around ethics training. So I won't read that out, but you might want to look through that to see what other training opportunities are available. So that said, Wendy, there's a bunch more questions for you. This one is from Manik Saini. What is the top thing that the health system can do to make trials more accessible to small and medium-sized private sector innovators? And maybe Gavin can chime in on that as well.
Sorry, you broke up. What can the health system do to make which more accessible?
To make trials more accessible to small and medium-sized private sector innovators. So Wendy, if you and Gavin can respond.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, again, that comes down to the collaboration. Working with organizations like Clinical Trials BC is critically important. You know, we have to make sure that regardless of the size of the organization, the ability to conduct clinical trials is there. Over the last year, I've had a number of smaller and medium-sized organizations that have reached out to me as they're trying to initiate their clinical trials, and they're having challenges either finding lab space, which is currently in critical demand in BC, and we have seen where organizations have taken their clinical trials or their lab work outside of our province because we don't have enough lab space today. But also I had an organization reach out to me about a month ago asking me where they could find COVID-19 blood samples. And, you know, again, they were a smaller organization. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to try and ensure that everybody has access to the supplies that they need. And I would say that Clinical Trials BC has an important role to play in that, but it's certainly something that, you know, needs to be worked on. I don't think we have a silver bullet answer to that right now.
And there's a question that I think overlaps between Wendy's and Mary's presentation. Oh, sorry, Gavin, did you want to respond a little bit to that as well?
Well, I was just going to say, I think that's essentially the ethos of Clinical Trials BC. Prior to the Academic Health Science Network and CTBC, there was something called BC Clinical Research Infrastructure Network, which was a very specific attempt to create the system and network that we all talk about. The systems and networks don't just happen. They need to be nurtured and created. So the Clinical Trials BC, the fact that people like Wendy sit on the Clinical Trials Advisory Council and others is that attempt to create the system and network that allows the cross-pollination of ideas and needs, and would encourage us all to use that.
Thanks, Gavin. And the next question, I think, spans Wendy and Mary's presentations. This one's from Graham Dixon. Besides complimenting you on a great talk, Wendy, Graham has the following question. You stated that prior to COVID, we haven't been in an environment that forced us to work together, partnerships. And I would say, Mary, that you were also emphasizing that point in terms of structural alignments within the system. But COVID has created that environment. Given Mary's earlier comment that we need to maintain some of these lessons moving forward after COVID, how would you describe the urgency once COVID moves off stage? So I think this is a sustainability question, and maybe Wendy and Mary can both answer it.
Okay, I'll jump in and then throw it over to Mary. So an expression that I think we all learned to dislike over 2020 was the expression, the new normal. But there are some elements that happened in 2020 of the new normal that I think we all want to see continue. And that is the amazing collaboration that happened across all sectors, all stakeholders, whether it be government, the healthcare system, industry, research, academia. Early in COVID, we, on behalf of the life sciences sector, had a PPE collection where we collected PPE from many of the labs that were closing and redistributed it to the front lines. And it was an amazing example of how we can collaborate effectively. So that is one element of the new normal that I hope we carry forward and take those learnings.
And Mary? I'm not sure that Mary can hear. If someone can type to Mary, that would be great. All right, I'm going to follow that up, Wendy, with a question that's along the same vein from Cindy Triton, and it basically asks you to expand on that point, but around sustainable infrastructure for the health system to support life sciences innovation. So what do we need to do with respect to infrastructure to sustain our motion forward post-COVID?
So that is a question that would be answered by all of the stakeholders coming together. So not only do we talk about what we think we need, but also how we can achieve it. But I would say that I don't think there's any sector right now that's better positioned to both drive the economic recovery and competitiveness of our province, while taking the innovation that gets produced and applying it into and adopting it into the healthcare system so that we can have a more sustainable and reliable healthcare system. And fundamentally, it's all about driving better patient outcomes. And so what do we need to do? We need to continue that collaboration. We need to take these examples of where we really quickly were able to adopt innovation. And it's not all products, it's even the ability to meet with your doctor virtually. Was a big change. And it's not that we didn't have the technology to be able to do it before, but we actually were able to turn it on really quickly. And there's countless examples of where that happened and where people collaborated incredibly quickly, whether it be Health Canada's emergency use authorization that they brought in or other adoption. And so one of the ways it's going to happen is us all working together. Another way is to not be scared to change and try new things and not be risk adverse. We can't always start with the answer no. We have to start with the answer of what's possible. And we have so many assets. And I know this is a global conference, but BC has so many assets. We have world-class science. We have world-class researchers. We have led the way in COVID-19 by working together as an ecosystem. And we should be able to continue to do that moving forward.
Thanks, Wendy. And following up from that, I'm going to pass the question on to Daniel. I believe that you have conducted a recent survey on barriers to trials in Canada during COVID.
Okay, I think I've been given a question. Is that right? It's been very difficult because I cannot hear Tanya. In BC, we've been successful in harmonizing the research ethics review approval process for multi-jurisdictional clinical trials. Now researchers would like us to harmonize operational approval, privacy review processes across the health authorities. Truly innovative. Are there ways the Ministry of Health can support us to come together and standardize these processes and reduce the amount of administration for clinical trials? Absolutely. I know that there have been discussions around this. I can't speak explicitly that we have put this forward strongly enough, but I think the session is to go back to my team and better understand how we can move that forward more quickly. So thank you very much for whoever asked the question.
Thanks, Mary. So I'll just rephrase my question to you, Daniel. I think you've conducted a recent survey at Health Canada on barriers to trials in Canada. I think it would be really insightful to share some of the lessons from a Canadian perspective for us here in BC.
I'm going to begin by reminding BC that BC is part of Canada as a whole. One province can't run alone. We have to work together across Canada. And for this reason, we looked across and found out the barriers were basically the same right across the institutions, whether you're in Ontario or BC. Ethics boards were one of them. Even though you have a United Ethics Board, there was complaints raised by the sponsors of new trials in Canada that it was very slow and it wasn't moving rapidly enough, that they had a lot of time lagged in there. The other one was contracting and getting facilities up and running. The third one was decentralized trials. Trials could no longer be done inside institutions, single institutions. The networks weren't able to take this on. Many of the networks had difficulty here, and they expressed that interest to us. For this reason, we're going to have to look at a more community-based, not institutional-based, but community-based networking where we get outside the academic institutions so we can have something that is responsive in a hurry. Also, you're going to have to look at how BC, your trials, can work with the rest of the networks in Canada because we just don't have enough people. The last thing that was noted in there was the pandemic wasn't uniform. We're now in a second or third wave, whichever way you look at it. But there was a period of time when trials opened up and they could not recruit anywhere in Canada, BC included. BC would open up a trial. They couldn't recruit because there's no patients. Yet, in Ontario and Quebec, we're starting to see the patients. So this has to be something more than just one center. We have to look at how we are going to be able to get across Canada, how institutes such as yours are going to work with other groups to get ahead. That was the finding that came back from the actual investigators on the sites? I leave it up to you people to comment on. I would be most interested to see what you would plan to do futuristically. What have we learned from COVID going forward?
Gavin, would you like to respond to Daniel?
Sorry, I was just trying to find my button there. And I think Daniel's points are very well taken, and I wouldn't want it perceived that BC is functioning totally autonomously. I think we look at integration with Health Canada, both for guidance and enabling both legislation, but also assistance in ensuring that the barriers to the system-wide change can be broken down as best as possible.
Thanks, Gavin. There's quite a few questions about training and whether things with a UBC tagline are only available to those at UBC. Anything out of Clinical Trials BC is available across the board. I can attest to that, as is much of the ethics training. But Daniel, there's quite a few services that Health Canada also offers in terms of facilitating, especially phase 1 investigators with, preclinical trial meetings and other opportunities. Can you expand a little bit on the services that Health Canada offers to innovators?
During COVID and all, this became quite a time-consuming event, but what we do offer is pre-CTA meetings, several of them to come along to help people, particularly new investigators and new companies that are trying to investigate, figure out how to get to the regulatory roadblocks of getting a clinical trial approved. These meetings take place once a week, twice a week, depending what it is. During the vaccines that were taking place literally 2 or 3 times during a week, the companies would come in, present what they had, or investigators present what they had, ask questions of what the regulator would be expecting in order to get that through, be given written responses back and come back in again. Some of them went 3 or 4 times to Health Canada for this information. It was a good learning experience for both sides. It allowed Health Canada to learn about the roadblocks that people were facing, find out the common questions, and also facilitated the reviews when they came in, because the reviews were then in such a way that they could be done within 14 days. During COVID, all COVID trials or COVID-related trials were done usually within 7 days, out and approved for Health Canada. The rest of the trials were still done during the 30-day turnaround time, but these were done in 7 days. The other thing that we did was we did put out a notice to stakeholders for COVID on what you could do for the regular running trials to facilitate them. For example, we looked at the regulations and in policy bent them a little bit to meet your needs. We were able to say, for example, for ethics boards and getting ethics consents, that you didn't need the written consent during COVID, you needed documented consent. Also with how do you handle the adverse events, picking up adverse events, recording adverse events. All of that was out on the website. A 3rd edition of that will be coming out shortly. So we've tried, and that was in response to the people out, investigators telling us the barriers they were going to have during COVID. Okay.
Thanks, Daniel. So I have a question here that's probably for Gavin, and I'm not sure if Mary can hear me or not. Maybe Rebecca can pass the question on to Mary to come in after Gavin. I'm pretty sure Wendy will have some things to say on this as well. It's a very important question, is what do you do with the results of clinical trials? So what is being done to ensure that results are translated into change in clinical practice within the province? Is this seen as a responsibility of the research community or others? Question from Heidi Scott.
So I'll just start off, because I think that's a great question and is to an extent at the heart of the BC Academic Health Science Network, where the intent is to create that learning health system that people like Danielle and others have spoken about so eloquently. But because there has been that gap of generation of new knowledge, change in practice, and improved outcomes. And it's the intent of envisioning a health science network or learning health system is to ensure that that cycle of continuous knowledge generation, change practice, improved outcomes, and new questions is a continuous process. And we have a ways to go, but I don't think it is one particular segment's responsibility. I think this is a shared responsibility across the system to ensure that we're doing that.
Thanks, Gavin. Rebecca, did you manage to get that question to Mary?
To add on to Gavin's comments. And I think it's very important, whether you're talking about translation of clinical trials into care, or whether you're talking about innovation more generally, to recognize that we need to create a system that values that and prioritizes. And our challenge, and I think I alluded to this in my talk, is that we're an amazing ecosystem, but we do need to have leadership in this area, which presumably comes the most easily from the Ministry of Health. Ministry of Health values in terms of the mandates that it puts out, the what it chooses to fund, what it doesn't choose to fund, the environment that it creates around operation, targets, care, and research. I mean, the ministry is leading this. So the ministry has done some amazing work on some important parts of our system, such as primary care and catching up on surgical volumes. But I think we need to have more explicit leadership, more explicit value put on innovation and put on research, so that we are focused on putting innovation to our system as quickly as possible, or explicitly to this question, bringing our clinical research to the bedside as quickly as possible. Right now, frankly, it's not talked about a lot in the mainstream. It's talked about in forums like this, but not in the mainstream. And if we want that to happen on a systematic, regular basis, we need to set a target around that. We need to measure it, and then we will definitely perform, because we've shown that we can perform when given the right targets, even very ambitious targets. So we just need to agree on what are the things that are most important for this health system to achieve and to accomplish and move forward. And certainly bringing research to the bedside would be one very important thing I think we'd all vote on as being a target that we'd like to see happen. Thank you.
Wendy, did you have any comments? Because I'd like to bring in another patient question. We've got just over 2 minutes.
Was I on mute the whole time?
No, we could hear you, Mary.
Okay.
No, I would just, and you were brilliant. I would just echo, really what Gavin and Mary said. And, we know from discussions that we've had in some public deliberations that patients want to know that their clinicians are dealing with the most current research and knowledge of whatever it is that they're seeing their clinicians about, and in many cases assume that they actually have it. And so I think Mary is right on in the sense of we have to determine what our priorities are. We know that we could be bogged down with 100 different priorities. So we need to figure out what our priorities are, set targets, and, we measure what matters. And when we measure things, we tend to be able to move the needle.
Right. We have just under 2 minutes left, so I'm going to squeeze in one more question from this patient related. And this one's for Daniel. Does Health Canada have any plans for incorporating patient input and priorities for clinical trials through a voice of the patient type process similar to what is being conducted by the FDA?
Canada is in the process of looking at how to use patient data, yes. Bring in that not only just in clinical trials, but also at drug authorization. How do you get the voice in? How do you realize it in a proper way? We have reached out to many of the patient advocate groups, and we'll be reaching out to a few others to find out how this is going to be done. So I suggest to whoever wrote the question, stay tuned, because I think you're going to hear more from Health Canada. This is an area that they've designated for further development.
Thanks, Daniel. That question was from Crystal Palladie. All right. So let me just see who this one's for. So I think this is a general question, whoever wants to chime in 40 seconds. The pandemic has highlighted the importance of research and it is the results of research vaccines that will release us from our home offices. How can we use this to further support the research enterprise and encourage support and participation in trials? Wendy, maybe that one.
You're giving me the final word in the last 20 seconds.
I am.
That's a very, very big question. But I think the short answer is yes, we need to make sure that we are continuing to take this research, going through clinical trials, supporting it so that we can return to society. As I said in my presentation, we have to solve the economic and health system issues for us to end up with a functioning society.
Thank you. So I'm hoping that we continue for another 15 minutes here. I think the session is ended. I'd like to thank all of the speakers and thank the audience for bearing with us with some technical issues through the session. And I'd like to invite the speakers to stay on for a few more minutes to, in type, answer the remaining questions in the chat because we didn't quite get through them all. So thank you very much.